It's certainly an honour to be here today to talk on this very important subject in what I can only describe as this truly remarkable building. Normally, I would say it's also a pleasure to be here, but the pleasure is somewhat muted by the topic I've been assigned, which strikes me as one of the most extraordinary complexity. And because of this complexity, I'm going to cut it down slightly. I much prefer the partial equilibrium approach of economics to the general equilibrium approach. So rather than redesigning the Constitution, I'm going to do something smaller. Redesigning, or indeed designing constitutions, is an enormous task. And even the greatest men, when they design constitutions, if they lived long enough, would see their work being redesigned. Consider, for example, the US Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and perhaps the greatest practical political philosopher of all, James Madison, combined, and their work has still been revised many times since. So designing constitutions is, I think, a useful but ultimately thankless task. I propose simply to take the constitution the ECB has today and tinker ever so slightly with it. And I'm going to address three problems. One which is entirely outside the ECB's constitution, but presents considerable difficulties for the transparent, efficient working of the ECB. Then I'm going to turn to the ECB's inflation target and discuss what I see as some slight difficulties with that. And then I'm going to consider inflation targeting in general, how it came about, and whether in fact it is a sensible, a practical, a workable idea. The first part of my remarks then concerns the environment in which the ECB operates. This environment was highlighted for you this morning in Juan Castaneda's fascinating paper on divergences in the Eurozone. These divergences were existing, some roughly on a scale like those of the US before the financial crisis. They then increased sharply and have not closed up to anything like the extent that they have in the US. And that is very important, because in the US there is what is generally called a banking union, complete integration of banking across the whole of the United States. And we are told that there is no banking union across the Eurozone. Well, that is absolutely true. I don't differ from the diagnosis at all. But the remedies proposed for the Eurozone's problems are, I think, entirely beside the point. The remedies proposed are two. The remedies from bureaucracies are always include more regulation. Well, we have more regulation. We have harmonization of regulation among the proposals. That's one. The second proposal is common deposit insurance across the Eurozone. That's another. Well, I'm not convinced that either of these would contribute much to creating a banking union, because they're made entirely ignorant, certainly if not ignorant of, certainly ignoring history. No one could deny that Britain has a banking union now. You could not, I think, deny that Britain had a banking union, perhaps since 1844, certainly since the 1850s. And what is striking about that observation is that there was no regulation at all of banking in Britain, apart from normal company and partnership rules, until 1979. The 1979 Banking Act, brought in at the behest of the EU. And secondly, there was no deposit insurance. And yet we had banking union in the meaningful sense that if the central bank, the Bank of England, made efforts to change the money supply, these were transmitted smoothly through the union, the banking union in Britain. They were transmitted in the way David Hume described, one of the great economists Tim did not mention earlier today. David Hume had a wonderful metaphor for the transmission of monetary policy. He compared it to a stone being thrown into a pool of water. There was an initial splash. Then the ripples spread smoothly entirely through the pool until they reached every little corner, every little crevasse in the perimeter. The ripples spread. We had a banking union like that in the middle of the 19th century from then. The EU does not. There are all sorts of barriers to these ripples spreading. And this, of course, impedes the smooth working of monetary policy. It therefore impedes the transmission of monetary policy, and it makes it harder for people watching the ECB to discern from their actions what they intend to do. You can, of course, listen to what they say, but watching people's deeds is usually a safer guide to what they intend to do than listening to what they say. Therefore, we have to take steps, some steps, to produce a banking union in Europe. What could these steps be? Well, what is missing is really competition in banking. Rather than worrying about regulation, rather than having banking authorities dealing with this matter, what we should have are the competition authorities of the EU, ensuring that there are no barriers to entry in national banking markets. And these barriers to entry take many forms. They take the forms, for example, of protection for local banks by governments. These governments, of course, protect the local banks because they often turn to the local banks in times of trouble for themselves and use them as little local piggy banks. So breaking this connection between governments and banks would be immensely valuable for the ECB. And it would, of course, also deal with another concern that people worry about in the Eurozone, what they call the doom loop. Because banks choose to hold their own government's debt. If a government gets into difficulties, the banks get into difficulties. If the banks get into difficulties, they try to turn to their own government, and turning to their own government may well get the government in difficulties. So this concentration for capital support on their own governments is very bad in all sorts of ways, and we should seek to produce the kind of competition in banking that we had. We don't have, by any means, ideal competition in banking now in Britain, but nor do we have, except when produced by regulators, nor do we have restrictions on competition in banking. New entrants are allowed to try to enter. It's difficult. They have to struggle. I know someone who's been trying to set up a bank, and he's based in Edinburgh. What sounder base could there be? He's trying to set up a bank in Britain, and he's been struggling against the FSA for some 20 years, and he now has actually opened an office in London. A small office in the first floor above a shoe shop in Bond Street, but still an office in London. So entry in banking is possible. That is the first thing that must be done. And if that were achieved, if we had something approximating more to a banking union across the whole of Europe, then we would have a more transparent, more smoothly functioning and better understood ECB. That is the first point I want to make. The environment, which is outside the ECB's control, is making things hard for them to function and to maintain its independence. It will come under political pressure to do things which it can't do or is not doing efficiently simply because the lack of a banking union is preventing it. That then is my first point. My second point, I now come to the ECB's inflation target. Now, I'm going to discuss inflation targeting in a little detail in just a moment. But I want to, first of all, tidy up a point about inflation targets. And this is that they have never been carefully explained. They have never been carefully explained to the voters, to the people who benefit or suffer from these inflation targets. Because there are many varieties of inflation targets. Now, unfortunately, seriously, our great economist Bennett McCallum wrote on them at great length. And he emphasized the importance of whether or not you corrected what we call base drift. In other words, if you drift away from your target for some reason or another, whether it's a shock, an act of God, a convenient term to conceal your own mistakes, or some other such problem, if your target was above, if you drift away from your target, do you have to correct it and not simply and get back to where you would have been had you not deviated from target? If you don't get back to where you would have been, that is base drift. So if, for example, you have a price level target, if some shock, let us be charitable and say some shock comes along and pushes prices away from this target, do you have to get back to it, or do you simply have to stop prices rising? They have very important consequences for the long-run behavior of the price level. If you accommodate base drift, for example, if you accommodate such a shock, then the price level in the future is completely unpredictable, because by the nature of shocks, by the definition of shocks, they cannot be predicted. So neither Charles, nor Juan, nor Tim, anyone in this room could predict the price level in, let us say, 25 years' time if you accommodated base drift such as that. And yet, not accommodating it, of course, involves squeezing the economy and perhaps squeezing output. So this has to be explained, and the voters, who are the people who are consuming this policy, have to have the benefits of accommodating it and not accommodating it explained to them. And that, I would not pretend that is straightforward. It's not. If, for example, we are going to squeeze the economy, there may be a drop in output while the squeeze is going on. I say maybe, and this takes me to the importance of expectations and the next point I would make. Let me describe how the gold standard worked. I'm not going to recommend at any point in these remarks that we return to the gold standard. I don't think it's feasible, apart from anything else. But let me explain it, because it's important to understand how it made prices behave. Under the gold standard, if there were a shock in prices in, say, the UK, there would be a tightening of money and the price rise would be reversed. And thus we had a very stable price level throughout most of the 19th century. And indeed, a purely artificial statistic made by choosing the dates, but the price level in Britain in August 1870 stood exactly where it did in August 1914. It drifted down and then it drifted up. Now think of the value of such a system. If you were contemplating a really long-term investment, you could think to yourself, when I have made this investment and it's matured in 10, 15, 20 years' time, the general level of prices, at least, will be where it is now, although there may have been big changes in relative prices. I know how to deal with them, that's my business. But the central bank and its policy will not have messed up my expectations about the general price level. And we know people thought like that. If we look at the series of bond prices or bond yields in the United Kingdom, again in the 19th century. I should explain, by the way, why I take most of these data from Britain in the 19th century. Not from any particular insular point of view. First of all, I'm supposed to be honest, it's easier to remember one country than to remember 10. But secondly, Britain has a much longer run of reliable economic data than almost any other country in the world. For a peculiar historical accident, Britain is an island, so its boundaries didn't change very frequently through the centuries, so we have a stable base from which to calculate these numbers. And that may sound trivial, but it's actually of immense practical importance. I was once involved with a colleague, Forrest Kepi, you know him, Charles, in calculating monetary statistics for the UK back into the 19th century. It may seem a trivial problem, but Southern Ireland broke off and became an independent country. That created the most immense difficulties for devising a consistent money supply series, because how much was to go to Southern Ireland, how much was to remain with the rest of the country? Not easy, and imagine that across every statistic, happening time and time again. I mean, heaven knows how the Italian national income statisticians have kept their sanity, frankly. So, it is important, in my view, to have an inflation targeting policy which is understood widely by everyone. And it's important, I think, that it be one which not to prevent base drift. And that takes me to my second point. Some people say that if you don't accommodate base drift, you're bound to have periods of deflation, falling prices, high unemployment. But again, if we look at a period when stable prices were actually expected, again, let me take the 19th century, although there have been some similar studies for the 20th century United States. If we take the 19th century in Britain, what do we see? We see periods of rising and falling price levels. Are the periods of rising prices always associated with strong growth, periods of falling prices consistently associated with periods of weak growth? The answer is no. The distribution is pretty well random. There was no systematic relationship between small fluctuations in prices and small fluctuations in output. People, in other words, were accustomed to stable prices and looked through these price level fluctuations. So then, the first thing is, if we are going to have an inflation target, the consequences of the kind of target you choose have to be explained clearly. Explained clearly to the electorate, explained clearly to people who are in charge of bringing them about, explained to the politicians who are in charge of watching the people who are bringing them about. Explanation and clarity and transparency in how this is going to work is of immense importance. And that really leads me on to my next section of my remarks. That sounded like perhaps a ringing endorsement of inflation targeting or price level targeting. Well, I won't tell you whether it was intended to be or not until we've thought a little bit about the history of inflation targeting. How did it come about? That very great economist, Milton Friedman, was mentioned once today so far by Tim in his remarks, in his fascinating remarks, and he produced a photograph of Milton Friedman. I'm afraid I haven't done that for you. I want to mention him again, though. Many years ago, an American economist, Lewin Yeager, organized a collection of papers on how to produce price stability in a free democratic society. Milton Friedman addressed this in, I think, a very important and not often cited paper. His paper was concerned with how to maintain price stability and a monetary policy not affected by short-term considerations, including political ones, but yet maintain it in a free society. And he reviewed several ways of doing this. He discussed central bank independence, of course, because the idea was common then that central banks were often interfered with, contaminated by politicians for purely electoral reasons. There is incidentally very little evidence for that. And the evidence comes mainly, remarkably enough, from a very small country, New Zealand. And New Zealand is very important in this story. But, and be that as it may, Friedman reviewed central bank independence, and he first of all said, what does central bank independence actually mean? Can you be independent to choose the colour of the coats the messengers wear inside your bank? The Bank of England traditionally wore pink, Hubland pink as it was called. How you to choose the colour of the paint on the door outside the bank. That's independence. How far does your independence range? Friedman argued that independence had to be meaningful, in that it was like the independence of the judiciary in a common law system. That is to say, politicians pass laws, the judges then interpret these laws and carry on interpreting them, ignoring any subsequent political guidance, including thinking, what did the politician mean when he passed that law? All they look at is what he wrote. If he didn't write what he meant, so much the worse for him. So they interpret them, reading them carefully, in the light of close readings of the text and precedent, entirely unaffected by politics. He said central banks, banking independence, if it is going to be meaningful, should be like that. The central bank should have a mandate, a set of instructions, corresponding to the laws given to the judiciary, and they should carry out these instructions, ignoring whatever else people say, until these laws, this mandate is changed. That was his definition of independence. Now, what should the mandate be? Well, people then were very concerned with inflation. Inflation was a problem. Why they were concerned with inflation then, as compared to later years, is really rather hard to imagine. The inflation rate was, if I remember correctly, something of the order of 3 or 4% per year. A high number over a long period, but not high compared to what we have experienced in some recent years. But they were concerned, and he therefore discussed inflation targeting. That has caught on and been very popular, for a reason I shall reveal in a moment. But Friedman pointed it as a fundamentally defective instruction for a central bank. Why? It's completely non-operational. Central banks cannot ever control the inflation rate. They may be able to control the trend of inflation, but the inflation rate, day by day, quarter by quarter, year by year even, is to a considerable extent outside their control. They can control the trend. So central bankers can almost say, don't worry, Prime Minister, don't worry, Finance Minister, I am controlling the trend of inflation. Although the inflation rate is today 25%, it's going to be back on trend at 1% in no time at all, don't worry. That might be a defence. And indeed, some provision has been made for that. In the Bank of England Act, not quite the most recent one, when the bank was given something called independence, there was provision that if something went wrong, if the bank missed its target, it wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, explaining why it had missed its target and saying what it was going to do about it. I say this from memory, but I don't think any one of these letters said we missed our target because money growth was too high. And I don't think any of these letters said we're going to get money growth back down and to hit the target. But entirely aside from that, were there any consequences of the target being missed? Invariably, no. What happened was that the Chancellor of the Exchequer wrote back to the Governor of the Bank of England an equally polite letter, essentially saying, don't worry about it, I trust you to do the right thing. Well, I don't think that's really a terribly operational, terribly useful procedure. But more important, it's giving the central bank something to do that it cannot do. Control the trend of inflation it can, but that is an unenforceable rule. So what can we have instead? Well, Friedman, in his article, which I've mentioned already, recommended that central banks, rather than inflation targeting, pursue a monetary rule, commit themselves to controlling the rate of growth of money. In that article, he did not specify, he was concerned with constitutions rather than with monetary technicalities. But what he did do in subsequent work, which he neglected in that one, was to say what kind of aggregate it should be. And here he was consistently with Tim. He was consistently in favour of a broad aggregate, not on a priori grounds, not on theoretical grounds, but purely from his great empirical work with the equally great economist Anna Schwartz. They examined the relationship between money and income, money and prices in the United States over a long period in a very great book, A Monetary History of the United States. And the money supply that came out as the most important influence on economic activity and on prices was a measure of broad money in the United States, an empirical judgment, one which is held up in every country. Incidentally, well, not incidentally, this is very important. How can this measure of broad money be controlled? There are various approaches to it. For example, some economists have said control the monetary base, narrow money. Almost nobody's ever done that. It's very difficult. But nonetheless, the money supply can be controlled as a meaningful operation. A colleague of Friedman and Schwartz, the very distinguished Philip Kagan, in his book The Determinants and Effects of Changes in the Stock of Money, 1863 to 1974, a rattling good read one, you would enjoy it. That book pointed out that many reasons caused fluctuations, small fluctuations in the money supply. But big fluctuations, up and down, always came from actions, often mistakes made for the best of motives, but often mistakes by the central bank. So then, the money supply is controllable. And Friedman's recommendation and my recommendation is that central banks should therefore adopt a money supply rule, committing themselves to doing this, explaining what they're going to do, explaining how it's going to operate. And of course, this is clearly observable. You can observe them if you wish, quarter by quarter, year by year. And you also know that if a fluctuation away from target lasts for more than 2 quarters, something is going to happen and they have to do something about it. It's a much more readily enforceable rule. In view of this, in view of the clarity of this, why do we have inflation targets? And here I come. It sounds like a digression, but it's important to understand how we got to where we are. We have inflation targets, by and large, because of New Zealand. Central banks existed for a long time before the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. It was created in the interwar years. But it was the first central bank to be given operational independence in the sense that it was told, you are now independent of the finance minister. You have to agree with him an inflation target. Once you've agreed it, it's up to you how you achieve it. And they were given an inflation target. Why were they given an inflation target, despite the strength of the arguments in other directions? The problem was they had been plagued with inflation. They had been plagued with inflation and, as it happens, political interference by a particular government in the New Zealand economy. So between between 1950 and around 1976, New Zealand moved from, I think, the 3rd highest income per head in the world to about the 25th. A precipitate fall. You could see it happening in the country. Is that all? All right. I was enjoying myself.
It's great. It's great.
Why did they bring this in? Because policy had been, in the words of the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Muldooned. Muldooning policy is not a word you'll have heard before. Muldoon was the Prime Minister of New Zealand who did all these things. He directed bank credit. He adjusted tariffs, all to favour his own political party and his own political career. And as the Deputy Secretary said, I want to stop policy being Muldooned. And that's how we have inflation targets, because everyone took this model from New Zealand. And they didn't think carefully. They bought a ready-made suit off the peg, and they didn't think a few adjustments might have made it better. I therefore propose that what the ECB should do, of all those who set the ECB statutes should do, is first of all deal with the lack of an open market in banking in Europe. Then remember that whatever target the ECB has, it has to be explained. And finally, move to a monetary target, which the ECB has to defend and explain every 2 quarters by 2 quarters. Explain why it's missed it or why it hasn't missed it. Because this is an operational procedure which should deliver better economic performance, better long-term growth, better price stability, and therefore greater political acceptability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Thank you. I do apologise for having to keep you to time. It was a magnificent tour de force, and I felt bad about it, but I
so you should.
Pedro a chance to talk and people to respond. I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker, so hold any questions, and you can come back to our 2 professors simultaneously. Pedro Schwartz, for a long time, was the Spanish classical liberal. He joined the Mont Pelerin Society at around the time of the beginning of the transition. And throughout that period, he was the voice, arguing for not only free market economics, but more broadly for a free society that elevates the individual above the state. He briefly served as a member of parliament, but really his contribution was in shaping the debate, and he became an international figure in doing so. Come away from feeling enriched and wiser. So, Pedro, please, how should the ECB respond to the launch of these cryptocurrencies?
Thank you very much, Dan, for praising me.
That one, so that we've got
Thank you.
recorded.
For praising me beyond my merits, but that's why I'm a friend. I love to hear all these things, and I hope I'll be able to be up to scratch.